So what if every single textbook you've ever read about the world's oldest hatred is just, well, completely wrong?
I mean, it's a massive question to start with.
Right. But what if anti-Semitism actually isn't about race? What if it isn't about wealth and has like absolutely nothing to do with a society just needing a convenient scapegoat when the economy tanks?
Which is the standard narrative we're all taught.
Exactly. But today, we are completely dismantling that standard historical narrative. So, welcome to the Playing Books podcast. If you're joining us today, you are probably someone who really wants to look past those surface level explanations of history, to understand the actual mechanics of human behavior.
Yeah, getting to the root of things.
Yeah. And that is exactly our mission for this episode. We are exploring a truly profound, meticulously researched, and honestly intensely relevant book. It is called Why the Jews? The Reason for Antisemitism, An Examination of Antisemitism, by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin.
It is, honestly, it's a text that completely upends how we diagnose societal prejudice. Because, we're so conditioned to view history through these very clean, predictable lenses.
We really want cause and effect to be simple.
Right, exactly. We assume that if a minority group is persecuted, it just must be because the majority is suffering economically and, they need someone to blame, or maybe because human beings just have this natural biological fear of the other.
The classic scapegoat theory.
Exactly. But the authors of this work demonstrate that when you take those generic templates of bigotry and apply them to the historical treatment of the Jewish people, the templates they completely shatter.
They shatter because the scale and the nature of this specific hatred just defy every standard rule of history. I mean, we are talking about a hatred that is uniquely universal, it's unimaginably deep, and it's strangely permanent.
Uniquely universal is a good way to put it.
Right, let's really look at the mechanics of that universality. Because when we say universal, we aren't just using hyperbole here. We are talking about an expulsion record that is, frankly, geographically and culturally staggering.
The historical record is chilling. Especially when you lay it out not as like isolated incidents, but as a continuous global pattern.
Which the book does so well.
It really does. I mean, you have England expelling its entire Jewish population in 1290.
All of them.
Every single one.
Yeah.
And then France enacting mass expulsions in 1306. And then again, because apparently once wasn't enough in 1394.
Wow.
And Spain. Spain is a massive one. This was the place where Jews had been deeply, deeply integrated into the cultural and economic fabric for centuries. And then suddenly, a total expulsion in 1492.
It's hard to wrap your head around that.
And it doesn't stop in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
You fast forward to the mid-20th century, right between 1948 and 1967, and you see nearly all the Jews living in Arab countries. We're talking Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. They're all forced to flee for their lives.
So this isn't just some localized prejudice based on a border dispute or something.
Not at all. It crosses continents, it crosses vastly different political systems, and it spans literally thousands of years.
And it isn't just about being asked to leave either. The depth of the hostility frequently bypasses just, mere discrimination and goes straight toward attempted annihilation.
Which is a crucial distinction.
Right, because if this were just about economic scapegoating, you would logically just marginalize the group, take their resources, and keep them around as an underclass so you can keep exploiting them.
You don't destroy your own economic engine.
Exactly. But the historical pattern here, I mean, all the way from the biblical accounts of the pharaohs in Egypt to the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1648 in Eastern Europe, it involves this specific desire for total eradication.
Yeah, the Khmelnytsky massacres alone saw hundreds of communities systematically slaughtered, and with a level of brutality that literally still shocks modern historians.
And of course, the Holocaust.
Right. Which really brings us to the permanence of this hatred. And that is perhaps the most confounding variable for sociologists to try to explain.
Oh, so?
Well, think about it. Once a group is entirely expelled from a society, logic dictates that the hatred should naturally dissipate over a few generations.
Because the target is gone.
Exactly. The target is literally gone. There's no one left to resent. Yet the hatred somehow survives as this cultural phantom. I mean, William Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, which features the heavily stereotyped Jewish moneylender, Shylock.
Right?
He wrote that roughly 300 years after every single Jew had been expelled from England.
That is wild.
Geoffrey Chaucer wrote horrific tales about Jews a whole century after the expulsion. You even see it in modern history.
Really? Where?
In 1968, Poland orchestrated this massive state-sponsored media campaign, unmasking quote-unquote Zionists. And this was in a country where the Jewish population had been reduced to less than 1/15 of 1%.
Wow. So how does a society sustain a visceral hatred for a ghost?
That is the exact question.
Okay, let's unpack this. How do you hate a ghost? And the answer the authors provide in the book is one of the most paradigm-shifting concepts I have honestly ever encountered. They call it the dejudaization of anti-Semitism.
It's such an important concept to grasp.
It really is. They argue that modern scholars, sociologists, even artists, they desperately try to explain away this hatred using literally any excuse except the fact that the victims are Jewish.
Right. They strip the Jewishness right out of the hatred.
Yeah, to make it fit into our neat little academic boxes. Like, why not just call it scapegoating or some psychological illness?
What's fascinating here is that blaming economics or psychology is what dejudaizes the hatred. It is the attempt to universalize a completely unique phenomenon.
Like trying to force a square peg into a round hole?
Exactly. If an academic blames a pogrom on an economic depression or the psychological illness of the perpetrators, they completely ignore the specific Jewish element. The authors put it brilliantly in the text. I have the quote right here. They write, "Economic depressions explain when Nazis came to power, but they do not explain gas chambers."
Oh, wow. That distinction is just monumental. I mean, if a society is economically depressed, the standard scapegoat theory totally explains why some demagogue might point a finger at a vulnerable minority at a political rally, just to distract the angry masses.
Sure, it's a classic political distraction.
But scapegoating is a temporary tool. Scapegoating does not require a regime to divert vital military resources and trains and personnel away from a multi-front world war that they are currently losing.
Right, just to build a continent-wide industrial infrastructure.
Specifically designed to hunt down and incinerate every single infant of one specific group. The Holocaust wasn't a distraction technique. It was the core ideological obsession of the state.
Precisely. And this is exactly why the psychological explanations are so incredibly dangerous. After World War II, there was this massive push in Western academia to study the authoritarian personality.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, the goal was basically to prove that anti-Semitism was just a symptom of a deeper psychological disorder, like a mental illness of sorts.
I mean, I could kind of see why people want to believe that, honestly. It's comforting.
How so?
It's like discovering a critical failure in your computer's operating system, but you choose to believe it's just a cracked monitor screen.
Ah, I like that analogy.
Yeah, because if it's just a cracked monitor, if it's just a few sick or deranged individuals, then the core code of your society is perfectly fine. It means normal, educated people are safe.
But if you misdiagnose a systemic architectural flaw as just a superficial hardware issue, you never actually fix the code. If we convince ourselves that the Nazis, or any historical anti-Semites for that matter, were just sick fascists, we completely miss the reality of the illness. We leave ourselves entirely blind to the exact same ideological hatred when it emerges from highly educated, socially normal, non-fascist sources.
And the authors point to Jean-Paul Sartre as a prime example of this intellectual blind spot. Sartre wrote this famous treatise where he essentially claims that the anti-Semite invents the Jew.
Right, the existentialist approach.
Yeah, he argued that the Jewish person is really just a blank existential canvas, and the hater just projects their own psychological insecurities and economic anxieties onto them.
It is a breathtakingly arrogant philosophical stance. I mean, Sartre, in trying to analyze the hatred, literally strips the Jewish people of their own active existence and agency in history.
He just erases them.
He claimed that the Jew only serves as a pretext. And therefore, his logic was, if you just fix the economic system, say, through a socialist revolution, anti-Semitism would just naturally vanish.
Which we know didn't happen.
Right, because he completely erases the reality that Judaism is an actual substantive entity. It has its own texts, its own legal framework, its own conception of God, and its own culture. It isn't just a reaction to persecution.
It's erasing the victim to explain the crime. And you see this exact same erasure in popular culture, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, look at the 1955 theatrical adaptation of The Diary of Anne Frank. When the playwrights adapted her actual diary for Broadway, they deliberately removed Anne's deeply personal musings about being hated specifically for being Jewish.
It's so tragic.
And it is, because Anne wrote so eloquently about the unique burden and suffering of the Jewish people. But the play replaced those very specific reflections with this generic, universalized platitude about how, we're all just people who suffer sometimes.
They watered it down.
Completely. They erased the specific Jewish identity of the most famous Jewish victim of the Holocaust, just to make the story more palatable and relatable to a general American audience in the 1950s.
Which perfectly encapsulates that de-Judaization myth we're talking about. By ignoring the specific Jewishness of the victims, society basically ensures it can never accurately understand the motive of the perpetrators.
So true.
So, the analytical mandate of the authors becomes really clear here. If this hatred isn't just generic scapegoating, and it isn't just economics, and it isn't just a psychological disorder, what is it about Judaism itself that specifically triggers this ancient, persistent hostility?
Right. If the operating system of the world is reacting violently to a specific piece of code, we have to actually look at the code.
Let's look at the code.
The authors identify the 4 foundational pillars of Judaism. And I want to stress to you listening, these aren't just theological bullet points. They are massive structural shifts in how human beings conceptualize reality. The first pillar is God, or more specifically, ethical monotheism.
Yeah, ethical monotheism. Sounds like a term you'd glaze over in a freshman philosophy class, I know, but it was a world-shattering revolution.
We really have to understand the ancient mindset to get this.
Definitely. Before Judaism, the ancient world worshipped pantheons of gods, and those gods were largely capricious, amoral forces of nature.
They were just powerful, not necessarily good.
Exactly. The gods of the Canaanites or the early Greeks didn't particularly care how human beings treated each other on Random Tuesday, as long as the humans offered the correct sacrifices, performed the right rituals, and paid homage to the power of the deity.
Keep the gods fed and happy, basically.
Right. But the Jews introduced an entirely foreign concept, a single, universal creator who makes absolute, non-negotiable moral demands on every single person in every single nation.
And introducing a universal moral authority is essentially declaring ideological war on the status quo. I mean, think about it. If you are a Roman emperor or some local tyrant, your entire power rests on the idea that you or your local state gods dictate what is right and wrong.
You are the ultimate authority.
Right. So if a group of people suddenly claims there is a higher invisible moral authority judging everyone, and that includes the emperor, that is a direct existential threat to the state's power.
Exactly. You are inherently challenging the legitimacy of every relative moral code on Earth. There is a profound quote in the book from Reverend Edward H. Flannery, who was a Catholic priest who studied this extensively.
What did he say?
He wrote, "The Jew carries the burden of God in history, and for this has never been forgiven."
Wow. The burden of God in history, that perfectly captures the weight of it. But, you know, a philosophical belief alone usually doesn't cause millennia of bloodshed.
Right. People disagree on philosophy all the time.
Yeah, I can believe in a universal moral truth. You might think I'm annoying or totally misguided, but you aren't going to organize a state-sponsored expulsion over what I happen to think in my living room.
It takes more than that.
The friction only really occurs when that internal belief dictates external behavior. Which brings us to the second pillar, Jewish law.
The Torah. Jewish law takes these vast, abstract concepts of ethical monotheism and concretizes them into daily, hourly actions. It's really the difference between a philosophical theory and an applied science.
It's the action part.
Yes. The laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, meant that a Jewish person in antiquity couldn't casually sit down and share a meal at a pagan neighbor's table.
Because of the food rules.
Right, because the food might be dedicated to a local idol or prepared in a prohibited way. And observing the Sabbath meant completely stepping out of the economic and social rhythm of the surrounding culture for an entire day, every single week.
It's a structural separation. You just can't blend into the background if your daily routine, what you eat, when you work, how you conduct commerce, revolves around a completely different set of absolute rules.
It makes the community highly visible.
And visibility combined with a different moral standard naturally breeds suspicion. But the third pillar is where that suspicion turns into active resentment. Here's where it gets really interesting. Pillar 3 is the chosen people idea.
This is undoubtedly the most misunderstood and weaponized concept in religious history.
Because on the surface, it sounds incredibly arrogant. I mean, almost every culture feels a sense of exceptionalism, right?
Right.
American exceptionalism is baked into our political rhetoric. The historical Chinese translation for China is the Middle Kingdom, which implies it is the center of the earth. The French have always felt a certain cultural superiority. So why does the Jewish claim of being chosen provoke a uniquely global, visceral hostility?
Because of what the texts actually claim they are chosen for. The Jewish concept of chosenness has absolutely nothing to do with racial superiority or inherent genetic dominance or a divine right to conquer other nations.
That's a huge misconception.
It's the biggest misconception. The doctrine explicitly states they were chosen by God to be the moral messengers to humanity, to carry that specific burden of God we just discussed.
Right.
When a small group claims that the ultimate creator of the universe tasked them with bringing his moral law to everyone else, it uniquely provokes the envy and resentment of the rest of the world.
It feels like a massive collective insult to the spiritual autonomy of everyone else. It's like, imagine a junior employee walking into a massive, deeply corrupt corporation and announcing that the CEO has personally appointed them to be the strict internal auditor for the entire company.
That's a great way to look at it.
The rest of the employees aren't just going to roll their eyes. They're going to actively try to destroy that auditor because the auditor's mere existence threatens their entire way of operating.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the dynamic.
Yeah.
And the results of this audit, the practical application of these values, lead us to the fourth pillar, the higher quality of Jewish life.
This one is fascinating.
It is. Now, the authors present compelling sociological data here, and they are meticulous about framing it. This is not an argument for biological determinism. It is an argument for the efficacy of a specific value system.
Values matter.
Exactly. Historically, regardless of whether a Jewish community was wealthy in Western Europe or impoverished in the Pale of Settlement, they exhibited incredibly distinct sociological traits.
The book cites the brilliant research of economist Thomas Sowell on this exact phenomenon, which I loved reading.
Oh, Sowell's research is incredible.
Yeah. Sowell studied various ethnic groups migrating to America. He noted that even in the 1920s and 1930s, when waves of Jewish immigrants were living in absolute grinding poverty in the tenements of New York, those specific slum neighborhoods functioned fundamentally differently from other impoverished areas.
It wasn't about the money.
Exactly. Despite the lack of wealth, they had significantly lower rates of alcoholism, drastically lower homicide rates, lower truancy, and massive rates of civic and educational engagement.
The value system of Judaism, the intense religious mandate for universal male literacy, the strict laws regarding family stability and sexual ethics, the institutionalized requirements for communal charity, it elevated the daily existence of its practitioners regardless of their external economic circumstances.
There's an incredible anecdote in the book that illustrates this perfectly. They talk about an old, battered text found in the YIVO library in New York.
I remember this part.
Stamped inside this book is the title of its original owners, the Society of Woodchoppers for the Study of Mishnah in Berdyshev.
It's amazing.
Think about the reality of that for a second. Chopping wood in 19th century Eastern Europe was grueling, backbreaking, low-status manual labor. These were men at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder.
The hardest lives imaginable.
Yet their response to their condition wasn't to hit the tavern and drink away their physical pain. They organized a formal society to gather after a brutal day of physical labor to rigorously analyze and debate complex, ancient Jewish legal and ethical texts.
It is a stunning testament to the power of those values. But, as the authors astutely point out, human nature is deeply flawed.
Right.
When one group exhibits a higher quality of life, specifically in areas of education, sobriety, and family stability, it rarely elicits admiration from the surrounding culture. Instead, it breeds intense, irrational resentment.
It's like the kid in class who constantly reminds the teacher to collect the homework. It just breeds intense, irrational resentment from the rest of the room.
Exactly. People do not like being presented with a living, breathing counterexample to their own societal failings.
It forces a mirror onto the surrounding society. Because if the impoverished woodchoppers can maintain a high level of intellectual and moral discipline, what is the excuse for the corrupt local magistrate?
There is none.
And this leads to a critical historical sequence that proves this entire phenomenon is fundamentally about Judaism, not about race at least, until the late 19th century.
Yes, the historical pattern of persecution is incredibly revealing here. For over 1,000 years, the persecution of the Jews followed a very specific three-step sequence.
What was the sequence?
Step one was always an attempt at conversion. Adopt our gods, accept our theology, assimilate into our culture, and all your problems will disappear.
Basically, just stop being Jewish. The admission ticket to safety was the surrender of their values.
Exactly. Step two. If the community refused to abandon their values and convert, the state enacted expulsion.
Just get out.
Right. And step three. If expulsion was impossible or failed, the result was physical annihilation. The crucial takeaway here is that historically, Jews could almost always escape the sword or the fire simply by converting.
Which proves it wasn't about race.
Exactly. If anti-Semitism were purely a biological or racial hatred, conversion wouldn't save you. You can't change your race. But because it was fundamentally an ideological hatred of Judaism and its moral demands, abandoning Judaism was the accepted escape hatch.
So, we have the why. We understand the 4 pillars: God, law, chosenness, and the resulting quality of life that act as the core code triggering the societal virus. Now we need to trace the how.
Right, how it evolved.
How did this ideological hatred morph and adapt through drastically different historical eras, wrapping itself in completely different justifications while keeping that exact same root cause? To do that, the authors take us on a comprehensive historical journey beginning in the ancient world.
In antiquity, we were basically looking at pagan anti-Semitism. The Romans and the Greeks were essentially imperial pragmatists.
We didn't care what you believed as long as you obeyed.
Right. They were highly tolerant of other religions, provided those religions were willing to add the Roman state gods to their local pantheon. It was a civic duty, a way of showing loyalty to the empire.
But the Jews categorically refused.
Yes. Their adherence to ethical monotheism meant they could not, under any circumstances, offer a pinch of incense to a statue of Jupiter or an emperor.
And the Greeks and Romans did not view this as some charming religious quirk. They hated this Jewish separateness. The book quotes Philostratus, who was a prominent 3rd century thinker in Athens and Rome.
What did he say?
He explicitly stated that the Jews are in revolt against humanity because they won't share in pagan tables or prayers or sacrifices.
Against humanity? That's intense.
To the pagan mind, refusing to worship the state gods wasn't just weird theological stubbornness, it was literal treason. It was a deliberate threat to the social cohesion and the political order of the empire.
But as we move forward in history, the dominant power structure shifts completely from pagan Rome to Christian Europe, and the nature of the hostility morphs into Christian anti-Semitism.
A whole new era.
Now, the friction is no longer about civic pagan duty. We are looking at a profound theological rebellion. The early church needed to establish itself as the true, legitimate heir to God's covenant.
Right.
The continued, vibrant existence of the Jewish people, the original covenant holders who read the exact same prophetic texts but flatly refuse to accept Christian theology, it presented a massive existential theological problem.
It's cognitive dissonance on a civilizational scale.
Yeah.
If the church is the new Israel, why is the old Israel still here, thriving and saying, no, you've misinterpreted the text?
It drove them crazy.
This theological friction birthed what the authors identify as the 3 medieval libels. These were monstrous, widely believed myths that were absolutely necessary to systematically dehumanize the Jewish people in the eyes of the European peasantry.
And we must understand the mechanics of these libels. They weren't just random insults. First was the blood libel, the horrifying accusation that Jews systematically kidnapped and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals.
Specifically for baking Passover matzah, right?
Yes.
Which is deeply tragically ironic considering Jewish dietary law explicitly and rigorously forbids the consumption of any blood, even from animals. The kosher slaughtering process is entirely designed to drain blood away.
It is the ultimate psychological projection. Then the second libel was the accusation of poisoning wells. This became particularly virulent during the Black Death in the 14th century.
Well, the plague.
Yeah, bubonic plague was wiping out 1/3 of Europe. The medieval mind had absolutely no concept of germ theory. They needed a tangible enemy.
Someone to blame.
Right, because the Jewish communities often lived in somewhat isolated quarters and practiced strict hand-washing and hygiene laws mandated by their religion. Their mortality rates were sometimes lower.
Which is just basic hygiene.
Exactly. But instead of learning from their hygiene, the European populace accused the Jews of poisoning the Christian water supply, leading to the preemptive burning alive of hundreds of entire Jewish communities.
That is just horrifying. And the third libel was host desecration. Medieval Christians believed in transubstantiation, that the communion wafer literally physically became the body of Christ.
Right.
Jews were frequently accused of breaking into churches, stealing these wafers, and stabbing or torturing them with needles in order to re-crucify Jesus.
It sounds like a dark, absurd fantasy to a modern listener, I know. But we have to realize that to the medieval mind, these libels were reported by religious and secular authorities as absolute, unquestionable fact.
They fully believed it.
The cumulative sociological effect of these libels was the ultimate dehumanization of the Jew as the literal child of the devil. And once a society defines a group as the devil's agents, any atrocity committed against them is not just justified, it is viewed as a holy necessity.
But history marches on. Eventually, we arrive at the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the era of reason, the scientific method, secular humanism. The power of the church is breaking. You would naturally think, finally, the secular rational thinkers are going to look at these medieval libels, realize they are absurd, and save the Jews from all this religious bigotry.
You would certainly think so.
Yeah.
But the Enlightenment thinkers hated the Jews just as viscerally, if not more so, but for the exact opposite reason.
This was a massive historical blind spot for me. We are taught to revere the Enlightenment as this era of pure objective tolerance. But if you actually read the foundational texts of these philosophers, their hostility toward the Hebrews is practically the bedrock of their secular worldview.
The authors highlight figures like Voltaire and D'Holbach. These were men deeply dedicated to destroying the political power of the church and eradicating organized religion in favor of pure secular reason.
Right.
And they ask themselves, who birthed this entire concept of religion?
Yeah.
Who brought the concept of a demanding, intervening moral God into the world, leading to the creation of Christianity?
The Jews.
The Jews. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the irony is just profound.
So it's the ultimate impossible catch-22. They were hated and slaughtered by the deeply religious Christians for not believing in the right version of God, and then they were despised by the secular Enlightenment philosophers for believing in God at all, for introducing the very concept of God to the world in the first place.
It reveals the tragic underlying consistency of anti-Semitism across completely contradictory worldviews. The admission ticket to Western society was always the exact same demand: stop being Jewish.
No matter who is in charge.
Right. For the Christians, it meant stopping your Jewish practices, abandoning your theology, and getting baptized. For the Enlightenment thinkers, it meant dropping your Jewish superstitions, abandoning your tribal identity, and becoming a purely secular, homogeneous citizen of the rational state. The demand, whether religious or secular, was always the complete eradication of Judaism.
This mechanism is so crucial to grasp because it leads us directly into the 19th and 20th centuries, where this ancient ideological hatred strips away its religious and philosophical masks and takes on terrifyingly extreme political and racial dimensions.
The darkest era.
Yes. Now, in this segment, we are going to look at the author's rigorous historical analysis of leftist, Nazi, and Islamic anti-Semitism. The authors, Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin, are mapping how these specific modern ideologies interact with the core values of Judaism.
And before we get into this next part about, leftist, Nazi, and Islamic ideologies, we have to make something crystal clear to you, the listener.
Very clear.
We are not taking political sides here, at all. We are strictly, impartially reporting the historical and ideological analysis provided by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin in their book. We are merely conveying the ideas contained in the original source material.
Exactly. We are just the messengers of the text here. So let's look at it. The transition into the modern era begins with an examination of leftist or Marxist anti-Semitism. And the authors do not rely on secondhand interpretations. They go straight to the foundational source text, Karl Marx himself.
Now, Marx was born to Jewish parents who had actually converted to Christianity before his birth to protect his father's legal career. But his own writings on the subject of Judaism are incredibly venomous.
The book details his 1844 essay on the Jewish question. In this essay, Marx essentially equated secular Judaism with the absolute worst aspects of capitalism and haggling.
Yeah, he wrote, and this is a direct translated quote from Marx, "Money is the jealous god of Israel, beside which no other god may stand."
Wow.
Marx argued a profound ideological point for the leftist movement. For the world to truly emancipate itself and achieve the socialist utopia, it had to emancipate itself from Judaism.
Because Judaism promotes individual responsibility.
Yes. He viewed the Jewish emphasis on individual responsibility, property, and religious law as entirely incompatible with the collective state. And this wasn't just theoretical philosophy confined to a 19th century pamphlet. The authors trace how this ideological hatred was translated into brutal systemic reality in the Soviet Union.
The mechanics of Soviet anti-Semitism are fascinating because they weren't primarily about mass extermination. They were about total cultural and spiritual erasure.
Right. The state above all.
Exactly. Communism, as a totalitarian system, demands absolute, unyielding allegiance to the state. Judaism, as we established with the first pillar, demands ultimate allegiance to God. Those two absolutes cannot coexist in the same geographic space.
The book recounts harrowing details of how the Soviet state targeted the specific pillars of Judaism. They didn't just target Jewish wealth, they targeted the transmission of Jewish values.
Give us an example.
In 1973, the KGB brutally beat young Jews in the streets of Moscow, simply for having the audacity to gather and dance outside a synagogue on the holiday of Simchat Torah.
Just for dancing.
Just for dancing. They targeted the language itself, too. The authors detail the story of Joseph Begun, a brilliant mathematician whose only crime was teaching the Hebrew language in secret.
And what happened to him?
For this, the Soviet state stripped him of his livelihood and exiled him to Siberia. The state correctly recognized that the cultural, linguistic, and religious identity of Judaism was a direct threat to the homogeneous nationalism required by the Soviet project.
From the totalitarianism of the left, we must transition to the most devastating manifestation of the 20th century, Nazi anti-Semitism. And this is a section where the authors profoundly challenge the standard curriculum taught in almost every Western high school.
It really is a paradigm shift.
Because if you ask anyone on the street, why did Hitler hate the Jews? The answer is universally because of biological race.
Right.
We are taught that Nazi anti-Semitism was an anomaly of pure pseudoscientific racism, but the authors argue that accepting this at face value is actually a massive historical misconception.
It is the ultimate modern form of dejudaization. The authors use meticulous historical evidence to correct this narrative. They argue that Hitler did not hate the Jews simply because of their genetics or the shape of their noses.
Wait, really?
He viewed them as the distinct race because he believed their values. The ethical monotheism they introduced to the world were inherently unchangeable and biologically embedded.
Oh, I see. According to Hitler's framework, a Jewish person couldn't just get baptized and suddenly possess noble Aryan values.
Exactly.
The Jewish commitment to a universal moral law, to the concept of conscience, was so deeply ingrained over millennia that it functioned like a biological trait that would infect the host nation. But the root of the hatred itself was fundamentally ideological.
The authors provide a stunning, almost unbelievable piece of evidence to prove this exact point. They examine the life and work of Houston Stewart Chamberlain.
Who was he?
He was a British-born philosopher who wrote a massive, sprawling book called The Foundations of the 19th Century. This book was arguably the foundational text of Nazi ideology. It laid out the epic, world-defining struggle between the creative Teutonic Aryan race and the parasitic Semitic Jewish race.
That's terrible.
It was. Chamberlain was revered by Hitler, yet Chamberlain painstakingly, in his own writings, dissociated himself from crude biological anti-Semitism.
Here is the smoking gun. Chamberlain actually dedicated his foundational, violently anti-Semitic masterpiece to a Jewish professor, Julius Wisner, his former botany professor in Vienna.
Which is just crazy.
How do you dedicate the Bible of Aryan supremacy to a Jew?
You can only do it if your hatred is not purely biological. If Chamberlain's hatred was strictly about DNA, dedicating the book to a Jewish man makes zero logical sense.
It contradicts everything.
Right. But because his hatred was fundamentally about the Semitic ideology, the specific moral values, the ethics, the monotheism that Judaism brought into the world, he could view an assimilated, highly secularized Jewish professor who had abandoned those values as a rare exception.
That is wild.
Hitler essentially took Chamberlain's profound ideological hatred of Jewish values and weaponized it with the unescapable, fatal label of race.
The ultimate weapon.
Yes. The Nazis correctly recognized that the Judeo-Christian moral code, the idea that thou shalt not kill, the belief in the inherent sanctity and equality of every single human life, was the direct, immovable obstacle to their fascist, social, Darwinist vision of a world ruled by raw power and racial hierarchy. To build their world, the authors of conscience had to be eradicated.
It is a terrifying realization that the Holocaust was an ideological war disguised as a biological cleansing. And from the devastation of Europe, the book then examines the modern, deeply complex eruption of Islamic anti-Semitism.
And again, we're just reporting the text here.
Exactly. The authors are very careful to establish the historical baseline here. During the Middle Ages, Jews generally lived in greater physical security under Islamic rule than they did in Christian Europe.
Yes. Though we must define our terms carefully, as the book does. Under classical Islamic law, Jews and Christians were considered dhimmis.
Meaning protected minorities.
They were protected minorities, but they were legally enshrined as second-class citizens. They had to pay a special, often crippling tax called the jizya, and suffer various mandated societal degradations to ensure they visually and economically deferred to the Islamic majority.
Okay, so it wasn't equal.
Not equal at all. However, they were generally not subjected to the systemic mass slaughters, inquisitions, or continent-wide expulsions seen in Christian Europe. The authors explain, however, that in the modern era, particularly post-1948, this relationship has ruptured into a virulent, existential hostility.
And the mechanism of this modern hostility is fascinating because the authors trace how classical, thoroughly debunked European anti-Semitic tropes have been imported, translated, and magnified in the modern Middle East to fuel political objectives.
Right.
For example, they point out that Egyptian state television, during the holy month of Ramadan, aired a massive, high-budget, 41-part historical drama series entirely based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion.
For context, for those who don't know, the Protocols is a demonstrably proven forgery created by the Russian Tsarist secret police over a century ago.
It's completely fake.
100% fake. It claims to be the literal minutes of a secret midnight meeting of Jewish leaders plotting to control the world's banks and media. It was literally Hitler's warrant for genocide. He assigned it as reading in German schools.
And now?
And today it is sold in mainstream bookstores across much of the Arab world, cited by political leaders, and presented to the public as absolute historical fact.
The book recounts horrifying modern tragedies to show how this imported ideology manifests. They discuss the murder of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl by Islamic terrorists in Pakistan.
Just an awful tragedy.
The terrorists didn't just kill him because he was an American or a journalist. They forced him to declare on camera, "My father's a Jew, my mother is a Jew, and I am a Jew," before they executed him. The authors cite official textbooks used in regional educational systems that literally describe Jews not as political opponents, but as the monsters of mankind.
The synthesis of all these modern manifestations is where the author's thesis truly locks into place.
How so?
When you look at Soviet communism, Nazi fascism, and radical Islamic fundamentalism, you are looking at deeply incompatible, often warring ideologies. Yet each of these extreme systems demands total, unquestioning allegiance to its specific utopian vision, be it the supremacy of the state, the purity of the race, or a specific religious political hegemony.
It's as if the world's most violently opposed ideologies can agree on absolutely nothing, yet they all look at the exact same tiny minority group and see their absolute worst existential enemy.
Because in a philosophical sense, they do. Judaism's foundational insistence on allegiance to a higher universal moral God inherently threatens the core mechanism of any totalitarian system.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. If the ultimate authority in the universe is a moral God who demands ethical behavior, then the communist dictator, the fascist Führer, or the extremist cleric is explicitly not the ultimate authority. The very existence of the Jewish people is a living, breathing historical reminder of a moral code that sits above the tyrant.
That reframes the entire geopolitical landscape of the 20th and 21st centuries. But the authors of the text don't just look outward at the enemies of Judaism. They also turn their analytical lens inward, addressing a deeply painful and complex internal dynamic.
This is a tough section.
It is. This takes us into the phenomenon of the non-Jewish Jew and how it fuels the modern mask of anti-Semitism known as anti-Zionism.
This is an incredibly sensitive, nuanced area of the author's analysis. We've spent the episode examining how external forces react to Judaism. Now we must examine the sociological phenomenon of individuals born Jewish who actively attack their own heritage and people.
The authors introduce the specific terminology of the non-Jewish Jew. Who exactly falls into this category?
The authors define them as individuals who are ethnically or historically born Jewish, but who have consciously rooted themselves in no Jewish religious, cultural, or national identity.
So they reject the pillars.
Exactly. They actively affirm none of the four pillars we discussed. For them, their Jewishness is purely an obstinate of birth, completely devoid of value or meaning. And historically, the authors note, some of the most virulent, damaging critics of the Jewish people have emerged from this specific demographic.
The book provides concrete examples. They cite the linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky, and the detail they include regarding Chomsky's associations is staggering.
It really is.
Chomsky actually wrote an essay defending free speech that was subsequently used with his permission as the foreword to a book written by Robert Forison, who is one of Europe's most prominent Holocaust deniers.
Just mind-boggling.
The authors point out that Chomsky's anti-Israel works are frequently distributed and sold in fringe catalogs directly alongside Nazi literature and white supremacist manifestos. They also examine figures like Norman Finkelstein, who has repeatedly and publicly compared Israeli military actions to the actions of the Nazis who persecuted his own parents.
The obvious analytical question is, what is the psychological mechanism here? Why does an individual actively align with movements that harbor deep hostility toward their own ancestry?
Right, why do it?
The authors provide a compelling psychological framework for the radicalization of the non-Jewish Jew. Having lost their roots, having consciously discarded the religious, ethical, and national identity of their ancestors, these deracinated individuals often seek to replace that void by adopting radical, universalist ideologies.
They want to transcend what they view as a narrow, parochial, tribal identity. They want to be purely universal citizens of the world, untethered to any specific tradition.
Precisely. But because they lack that internal historical grounding, they often define themselves entirely by what they oppose. They attack the system, which often includes Western democratic society, American hegemony, and specifically the State of Israel.
It's a way to prove they don't belong to the group.
Yes, by aggressively tearing down the structures of the specific culture that makes them feel marginal or conflicted, they seek to validate their own rootless, universalist worldview. It is a profound psychological defense mechanism that tragically and practically aligns them with the very forces seeking the destruction of the Jewish people.
Which brings us directly to the intensely debated concept of anti-Zionism. Now, if you're listening to this, you might be asking a very logical, common question.
Can't someone simply criticize Israel?
Exactly. Can't someone simply criticize the political actions of the Israeli government without harboring any hatred toward Jews?
The authors address this distinction with absolute clarity. Criticizing Israeli policy is absolutely fine. It is not anti-Semitic.
Not at all.
In fact, the most vicious, relentless criticism of Israeli government policy happens every single day in the Hebrew language press within Israel itself. But anti-Zionism is fundamentally not about criticizing policy.
What is it then?
Anti-Zionism, by its ideological definition, seeks the destruction and dismantling of the Jewish state entirely. It denies the fundamental right of Israel to exist as a sovereign entity.
Right. And this goes back to our earlier discussion of the core code. Remember the 4 pillars of Judaism: God, law, chosenness, and nationhood.
Nationhood is key here.
The historical connection to the land and the concept of Jewish nationhood is a foundational, non-negotiable pillar of Judaism. Therefore, the authors argue, denying the Jewish people their right to a nation, especially while simultaneously defending and championing the right of every other ethnic and indigenous group on earth to self-determination, is inherently discriminatory and anti-Semitic in its effect.
The authors dedicate a substantial chapter to deconstructing what they term the 8 lies about Israel. A primary focus is dismantling the prevailing modern myth that anti-Zionists are entirely distinct from anti-Semites.
They don't buy that distinction.
Not for a second. They argue that if you isolate the one single Jewish country on the planet, subject it to standards applied to no other nation, and demand its total dismantling, your political motivations are inextricably linked to the Jewishness of that country.
I think about it like this. Imagine someone saying to you, listen, I don't hate you. I don't have any personal prejudice against your family. I just firmly believe that your specific house shouldn't exist, so I'm going to burn it down, evict your family, and ensure you wander the streets without shelter forever. But remember, I don't hate you.
It's absurd.
The intellectual distinction between I don't hate you and I am actively burning your house down is a meaningless academic luxury. To the person inside the burning house, the result is identical to pure hatred.
That captures the practical reality perfectly. This raises an important question. And this mechanism explains a deeply concerning trend that Lawrence Summers, the former president of Harvard University, addressed in a highly publicized speech cited heavily in the book.
What was his warning?
Summers warned that while traditional anti-Semitism used to be largely the domain of poorly educated right-wing populists or fringe extremists, today, profoundly anti-Israel views are finding massive institutional support in progressive intellectual communities and elite university campuses.
Which is terrifying.
Actions and rhetoric that are deeply anti-Semitic in their practical effect, if not their conscious intent, are being championed by highly educated people. Anti-Zionism has effectively become the socially acceptable, polite academic way to express hostility toward the Jewish collective in a post-Holocaust world where traditional racial anti-Semitism is taboo.
You can't say I hate Jews at a cocktail party, but you can say I hate Zionists and achieve the exact same exclusionary result. So, the authors have masterfully diagnosed the illness. We've traced its history from the Romans to the Soviets, explored its psychology, and unmasked its modern political disguises. The inevitable question is, what is the cure?
We need a solution.
In the final, most philosophically dense section of the text, the authors lay out what must be done and examine why previous historical attempts to solve this problem have failed.
They meticulously examine several historical strategies employed to cure anti-Semitism. The first major strategy was assimilation.
This was the hope of the Enlightenment. The idea that if Jews just blend in, drop the dietary laws, start wearing distinct clothing, and become completely indistinguishable from their German or French neighbors, the hatred will naturally evaporate because the target is no longer visible.
And, as the authors point out, on a purely individual level, assimilation sometimes works. You can personally escape the hostility by ceasing to be the target.
But as a group,
But as a macro solution, it is culturally tragic because it requires the complete erasure and suicide of a thousands of years old heritage. Furthermore, historically, as we saw with Houston Stewart Chamberlain and the rise of the Nazis, deep assimilation didn't even protect the highly secularized Jews of Western Europe.
the hatred just adapted.
The hatred simply morphed from religious to racial to find them.
The second massive historical approach was Zionism itself. The original secular Zionist thinkers in the late 19th century, men like Theodore Herzl, believed that the root cause of anti-Semitism was the abnormal socioeconomic condition of the Jew.
They thought it was about being stateless.
They argued that because Jews were always a stateless minority, they were unnatural and therefore hated. The theory was that if the Jews just had their own normal sovereign country with their own farmers and their own army, just like the French have France or the Italians have Italy, the world would finally view them as normal and the global hatred would cease.
But the authors note the bitter, inescapable irony of history here. Zionism was wildly successful in creating a miraculous, culturally vibrant, and physically necessary haven for the Jewish people.
Israel exists.
Yes. But it completely and utterly failed in its original philosophical promise to end global anti-Semitism. In fact, as we discussed regarding anti-Zionism, the existence of a sovereign Israel has in many ways simply provided a centralized, macro target for the world's hostility to focus upon.
So if assimilation is erasure and statehood doesn't cure the underlying ideological disease, what do the authors suggest?
They propose a more active, outward-facing approach, actively seeking converts.
Which is wild because that goes against centuries of insular Jewish tradition.
It does. It's a fascinating pivot, but they argue that actively welcoming non-Jews to convert to Judaism serves multiple purposes. It demystifies the religion, breaking down the secretive stereotypes. It builds demographic numbers and global alliances.
And it destroys the racial trope.
Crucially, yes. It destroys the anti-Semitic racial trope that Jews are an exclusive, genetically chauvinistic club.
Makes sense.
Additionally, the authors emphasize the absolute, pragmatic necessity of combating anti-Semitism, physically, politically, and legally, whenever and wherever it rears its head. Jews cannot rely purely on the goodwill of host nations.
But none of those strategies, assimilation, statehood, conversion, or self-defense, are the ultimate solution. The authors present a final, overarching conclusion that fundamentally alters how you view religion and society.
It's the core of their thesis.
Because they establish that the root cause of anti-Semitism is the moral challenge of Judaism, that burden of God, bringing absolute morality to a flawed world. The only way to truly, permanently end the hatred is to convince the world to adopt God-based morality.
It is the ultimate, elegant synthesis of their entire historical argument. If the friction is caused by contrasting moral systems, the friction only ends when the systems align.
The systems have to match.
Yes. The ultimate mission of the Jewish people is to spread ethical monotheism. And the authors outline a crucial, two-part philosophical formula demonstrating why this is the only viable path forward for human civilization.
What is the formula?
The formula is, ethics need God, and God demands ethics.
Let's break the first half of that down deeply because it's massive. Ethics need God. A secular humanist would argue that we don't need a deity to know that murder is wrong. We can use reason to build a just society.
And the authors dismantle that secular optimism by looking at the reality of the 20th century. If there is no ultimate, transcendent moral authority, if there is no God, then ethics are entirely relative.
Morality just becomes a trend.
Morality becomes nothing more than the temporary consensus of a society, or worse, the subjective decree of whoever holds the most power. And if morality is relative, you get the horrors of secular totalitarianism.
Like the Soviets.
You get the Soviet gulag, where the good is logically defined as whatever serves the economic progress of the state. You get Auschwitz, where the good is legally and medically defined as whatever serves the genetic purity of the Reich. Without a transcendent God to say murder is objectively wrong regardless of what the state laws say, objective morality collapses into pure power dynamics.
That is a devastating critique of pure secularism. But the authors are equally critical of the other extreme. The second half of the formula is God demands ethics.
Because religion that is stripped of a primary absolute focus on how you treat your fellow human beings is equally, if not more, terrifying.
How so?
If you have a belief in a God who demands absolute faith or strict ritual observance or holy war, but doesn't strictly and primarily demand ethical behavior toward the stranger, then God simply becomes a divine tool used to justify immense human evil.
Like the Crusades.
You get the religious massacres of the medieval Crusades, authorized by the Church. You get the terrorists of 9/11 shouting that God is great as they intentionally murder thousands of innocent civilians. God without ethics is tyranny. Ethics without God is subjective preference. Only ethical monotheism binds the two.
The irony here is just staggering when you step back and look at the whole picture. The very thing that caused the hatred in the first place. The Jews introducing a demanding, absolute moral God to a world that wanted to do whatever it pleased is the only thing that can actually cure the hatred.
The cause is the cure.
The world fiercely resents the moral standard, but only when the world finally accepts and internalizes that exact same moral standard will the resentment fade.
The book quotes the great 20th century philosopher and theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel, who perfectly summarized the tragedy of assimilation. He said, "The Jews are a messenger who forgot his message." The authors argue that the ultimate goal of history is not to formally convert the entire population of the world to the specific rituals of the Jewish religion. That has never been the objective.
It's about the values.
The goal is to convert the world to the underlying operating system of ethical monotheism to a universal God-based morality. When the world finally shares that fundamental moral architecture, the ancient hatred of the people who originally introduced it will cease.
We have covered an immense amount of historical and philosophical ground today. We've seen how this profound text completely reframes our understanding of global history. It takes the world's oldest hatred out of the generic, inadequate bucket of scapegoating or racism and exposes it for what it truly is: a millennia-long violent rebellion against the moral demands of ethical monotheism.
It forces every reader to confront the reality that human history isn't just a mechanical process driven by economic forces, geography, or resource scarcity. History is fundamentally driven by ideas, by competing values, and by the profound, often violent friction that occurs when a higher moral standard is introduced to a deeply flawed world.
I want to issue a direct challenge to you listening to us right now. Take these ideas and let them enhance your life. Let this framework change the way you consume information. Use this lens to look past the superficial, surface-level excuses people make for prejudice and political hostility. The next time you read the news, don't just look at the political borders or the economic disputes. Examine the actual underlying moral values driving the conflicts in our world.
That's a great challenge.
And please, we want you to be an active participant in this conversation. We strongly encourage you to engage with the authors on social media, share your thoughts on these concepts, and ask difficult questions. But above all, you need to purchase this book, Why the Jews? The Reason for Antisemitism, an Examination of Antisemitism, by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin.
You really do.
We have only scratched the surface of the meticulous historical evidence, the data, and the philosophical arguments they provide. To truly understand the mechanics of this phenomenon, you need to read it and absorb it for yourself.
It is absolute essential reading for anyone trying to make sense of the ideological undercurrents of the modern world.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. If you found value in this podcast and our exploration of history and ideas, please follow, subscribe, and share the Playing Books podcast with your friends and network. Your support allows us to keep bringing you these vital insights.
I want to leave you with one final thought, building directly on the implications of what we've discussed today. The authors powerfully argue that historically the treatment of the Jewish people serves as humanity's ultimate moral barometer. It reveals the true health of a civilization.
The ultimate test.
But ask yourself, what does the current rapid rise of global anti-Semitism reveal about the deeper values, or perhaps the lack thereof, animating our own society right now? When the diagnostic machinery of history shows us this ancient ideological hatred reemerging in our streets and institutions, are we merely witnessing a political crisis, or are we actually witnessing a profound spiritual one?